Okay, we are recording. You are good to go.
Okay, you want me to just go ahead and start up and introduce myself? That works?
Yeah, why? Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Appreciate the invitation to speak to you folks tonight. Looks like we got a nice crowd going. My name is Steve Repasky. I'm a certified master beekeeper. Contrary to what Landy says about me, I do know what I'm doing in the bee yard. But I'm a certified master beekeeper, second generation. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I operate about 200 colonies as a sideliner operation. It's not my full-time job. It sometimes certainly feels like it. I wrote the book Swarm Essentials, and a lot of what you're going to hear tonight is in the book. We're not going to go into the detail that the book goes into, but certainly we're going to cover the bases, so to speak, and take a look at some of the things that go on in the hive, and more specifically about what goes on in the hive during swarm season. We're not going to talk so much about catching swarms because everybody can do that. That's very easy. But we're going to talk about some of the signs that you might see as we progress into swarm season and then come out of swarm season, and how you might want to address those issues in the hive itself. So without further ado, I'll move forward and talk about the presentation tonight, which is swarm management, what's really happening in your hive. I'm going to try to watch the question in the chat. If I don't get to your question, don't fret. I will certainly address it at the end if we need to. So no worries there, but feel free to ask away. And if I see it, I'll answer it. If not, we'll catch it at the end. Now, as far as swarming is concerned, it's a natural asexual means of reproducing at a colony level. We all know that the queen produces eggs and turns into larvae and adults, etc. But swarming is a way for a colony to divide at a larger scale, right? So they divide in half. The queen, typically the mother queen, leaves with half the colony initially, followed by several after swarms, and they spread their genetics across the landscape. You'll often see them in early spring, and typically will coincide with the peak nectar flows that are in your area. The role of swarming historically has just been large-scale reproduction, as we mentioned. But more recently, since the mites arrived in 1987 here in the United States, swarming also has a bigger influence on mite reproduction in terms of breaking the brood cycle. And of course, beekeeper education. Those of us that have gone on swarm calls to capture swarms, you show up at the residence and the homeowners are there, the neighbors are there, the mailman stopped by, they called their cousins from 4 doors over, they're down the street. So we're sitting there catching a swarm and educating beekeepers at the same time. So there is a very important role that these swarms play in the environment. Excuse me. Now, as far as timing and frequency, swarms will vary through latitude. They happen earlier in the south, a little bit later in the north. Drone production often triggers the swarm impulse, as well as the resource availability in terms of how much nectar is being brought in, how much pollen is being brought in. We know that pollen is the protein of the hive and helps with brood production. The nectar stimulates wax production. And then, of course, we look at the time of day can be influenced, or the swarms can be influenced by the time of day. This graph that we have here, and this is going to be very similar to where you guys are in New Jersey. I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm in Southwest Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, and you're kind of directly across from us. So you're a little bit more influenced by the ocean weather, but not a whole lot. So whatever I talk about here today, you might need to adjust it accordingly to your local area. But in general, swarms, you see with this blue graph, is the production of drone brood in a colony. So our drone brood actually starts much earlier than we see the queen production, which are the green graphs. And by the time we have a peak drone production, you see that drone production starting to fall off a little bit. But at that time, just because the production is dropping off in drones, all that means is that we have a large amount of sexually mature drones out there waiting to mate for all of these virgin queens also waiting to get mated. So right in here is where we see the largest amount of swarms, and then you get this little peak again in in drone production and queen production later in the summer, which also coincides with the fall nectar flow in some areas. As I mentioned, these swarms do occur earlier in the south and later in the north. The drone production, you're going to see about 4 to 6 weeks prior to swarming. Some of you might have been on here early enough to hear us just chatting back and forth about the brood that we saw in our colonies today. And most of the brood right now, at least in southwestern Pennsylvania, is about the size of a smoker, a little bit bigger, and it has just recently been capped about a day or two. So we're still a long ways away from drone production, which is great because that tells me that as it stands right now, the earliest I might see a swarm is that first or second week of April. So I've got some time, but you're going to see that drone production start about 4 to 6 weeks prior. And I use dandelions as the environmental sign because when dandelions show up, that's a good indicator to me that I'm about a month away from peak swarm period, not the start of swarm season, but the peak of swarm season. So all of these types of things that you're looking at will have an influence on your swarm season in your area and what you may or may not want to do within the colony itself. The frequency of swarming will vary widely as well, depending on resource abundance, right? How much pollen and nectar is available will be a deciding factor on how much brood is produced. And if you have a lot of brood in a smaller area, there's a greater chance that that colony is going to swarm multiple times. You also have to take into consideration colony equilibrium. And colony equilibrium is a colony that has a single queen, numerous drones, and many workers. And when you add an additional number of queens to that colony in terms of queen cells, or whether they're virgin or mated queens, you throw off that equilibrium, and we have to get back to that. And that takes time as well. And that's going to impact the frequency of how your colony swarms. Certainly genetics plays a role as well. The lack of space, where are they storing the nectar, the environmental conditions in terms of weather, is it really warm and then gets cold and rainy and then warm again, how old your queen is, the amount of pheromone that's being produced by the queen and how much it's diluted within this overcrowded colony. All of these things play a role in the swarming behavior. This graph or this chart or picture here is from Dr. Christina Grosinger out of Penn State. And it kind of shows you the complexity of the swarming behavior. One of the things that we often see the most are these changes in colony condition, which is, your workers are engorging with honey. You have a lot of rearing of queen cells. The queen is being slimmed down so she could fly. You see this rapid population growth of bees as they emerge from their cells. And of course, the non-chemical signals we may also see or hear in terms of waggle dancing, the piping of workers, etc. The colony leaves, and once the colony leaves, or the swarm leaves the colony, we now switch to more chemical signals where the queen pheromone have a cohesion effect with the swarm as it moves through the air, lands on a temporary resting spot. Once they rest temporarily, you get these non-chemical signals that play a role again. They pick up to their new home. The pheromones play a role in that cohesion again. And at that point, they land and establish themselves. So it's a very complex process. Some of it we can see, some of it we can't, but it certainly makes for a entertaining period in our bee yards for sure. Now, I like to break swarming down into 3 different stages. The first stage is what I call pre-swarming. This is typically where we would enter swarm prevention mode, right? Splits, checkerboarding, so on and so forth. We may get we do enter then the second stage, which is what I call active swarming or swarm mitigation. And it's not really mitigation. It's more just a really quick time period, very short. It's a time period that we often miss as beekeepers because we quickly move into that post-swarming. Our colony has already swarmed, and now we got to figure out what to do with the colony that has swarmed once, twice, 3 times. I see Landy's being a funny person here and asking about streaking if they take off their stripes and fly around naked. This is not EAS, Landy. This is a professional talk. So yes, streaking, though, with bees in that slide, if I can go back here briefly, streaking, where did I see that? Here in the migration part, and you'll see it in both migrations, but more so in the movement of the bees to their new area. And if you ever stop and watch a swarm pass over you, not resting, but as they go from one spot to the next, you'll see bees zipping from one end of the swarm to the other. And these are the bees that are kind of just leading the way to their new location. It's not the queen that they follow. The queen's mixed in that whole bit, but you'll see these queens just zipping back and forth from front to back, that kind of leads that swarm to their new location. It's a very good question. As we move in, so backing up here again one more time, the 3 stages, we have the pre-swarming, which is a fairly long period, active swarming, which is a very short period, and the post-swarming, which is another potentially long period. So as we dive into these a little bit deeper, the first stage is pre-swarming, what I call the prevention. It's not, I'm not going to go into this real heavily because this is a 4-hour talk in and of itself just on prevention. But the important thing to remember about that prevention mode, which is 4 to 6 weeks prior, is that the timing is critical. We might be successful or we might have an exercise in futility depending on what we do. That 4 to 6 week time period is typically from when you start to see drone production all the way up to the very first swarm, but usually no later than time at which the queen cells appear, right? So drone cells start showing up in our colony, and then your queen cell starts to appear. That's your prevention pre-swarming time period. Prevention is not an absolute or required management skill. You don't have to stop your colony from swarming. Swarming is a very healthy activity for your colony, but certainly you don't want to lose your bees either, because that's a potential loss of a honey crop. There's lots of various schools of thought and techniques on prevention. As I mentioned, we're not going to get into it, but there are things that you need to pay attention to, because it's going to help you help guide you as to where you are in the swarm process and what you may or may not want to do as a beekeeper with that certain colony. So certain things we want to consider in this whole prevention time frame is the timing of your blooms. When do your dandelions bloom? When do your black locust bloom? Your maples, all these things play a role in development of the colony. The historic swarming dates to your local area are important. Here in Western Pennsylvania, I usually get a phone call or two about swarms, April 1st, 2nd, 3rd. It's usually a given. And then it dies down for a week or two, and I'll get 3 or 4 more calls, and then it'll die down. And by May 1st, I can guarantee you that it will be a swarm a day all the way up through the middle of June, peaking around the 3rd, 4th week of May in my area of the country. Also, internal hive observations. What do you see? What is popping up? How often are you going to see these queen cups or these play cups start to show up? You typically start to see them more and more the closer the bees get to the swarm impulse. So often when it comes to these observations, beekeepers are too late when it comes to preventing that swarm. We react to seeing the swarm cells rather than minimizing, right? We open up, we pull a frame, we see the queen cells, we panic, we scrape them off with a hive tool, and we put the frame back in, take a deep breath, and say, okay, I stopped my swarm. And in reality, we're too late. That colony may have already swarmed. So if you're going to practice prevention, you want to start it at least 4 weeks prior to the average date of your first swarms, or at worst case, when dandelions begin to show, because you're getting much, much closer to that swarm impulse. Purple-dyed drones is also a good indicator within the hive. We talked about environmental indicators like dandelions. The purple-dyed drones are another environmental indicator within the colony. And the purple-dyed drone stage is a drone, it's a capped drone. The brood is capped, but when you open it up, you see the white pupa with the dark colored eyes. Typically, that drone is about 12 to 15 days old. And when you start looking at the math and the biology, that drone is going to take another 10 days to emerge as an adult, plus another 12 days or so to mature, become sexually mature. So we're about 21 days from purple-dyed 21 days from purple-dyed drones until you have a sexually mature drone. And when you throw in the queen production right around that same time frame, it takes 16 days for that queen to emerge and another week for her to become sexually mature. So now you're right around, again, that 22 days. So they're actually pairing up biologically to have both mated drones and virgin queens ready to mate at that same time. So those types of things internally you want to watch for. As I mentioned, there's lots of different techniques and schools of thought for prevention: reversing hive bodies, artificial splits or swarms, using young queens from the previous fall to minimize swarming that spring, adding supers, checkerboarding, cutting cells, all these things. You can go on about them. I added queen excluders not as a prevention technique, but as a note that queen excluders do not stop swarming. It might buy you a couple of days, but they are not useful because they will only prevent the mother queen from leaving, not the virgin queen. So we're not going to get into it any further. We're going to move right along into the next stage. So this was a 4 to 6 week time period. We've quickly moved forward into the active swarm period. And this is a situation where queen cells of all ages are present, and we may or may not know that the colony has swarmed, right? The easy part, we see the colony hanging from a limb, but we may not know which colony they came from. We might have an idea, but before you do anything else, you need to do some investigating. And I will comment here that the numbers of bees in the colony is not an indicator of which colony swarmed. You have to take a look a little bit deeper, because a colony can swarm with upwards of 70% of the bees that are in there. But keep in mind that colonies that do swarm are already in an overcrowded condition. So when you release some of the air out of an overinflated tire, you still have a very inflated tire. And it's the same thing with the bees. So before you act, do a little bit of investigating there. Now, as far as what I'm seeing in the bee yard, some of the behavior are very easily identified. One of them is the activity at the hive in terms of lack of foraging. Leading up to a colony taken off from a hive, you're going to see this crowded condition during optimum foraging time. We often call it bearding, not to be confused with the bearding that we would see in late summer due to a hot, not so well ventilated hive. If we see crowded conditions and bearding during optimum foraging time, 10, 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the afternoon during swarm season, there's a good chance that colony is ready to go within the next 12 to 24 hours. Then you move on to the rapid, the issuing of the swarm, the leaving of the swarm from the colony, rapid exit, disorganized flight, that loud hum that you may often hear in your bee yard as they fly over the horizon, never to be seen again. You might find the bivouac, the temporary resting spot, and we're all familiar with that as a swarm and what it looks like. If you have swarm traps up, you might see activity at that swarm trap where the scouting party, which can be anywhere from a dozen to several hundred bees, checking out that new location. Is it right for them? Does it smell good? Is it well shaded? Is it facing the right direction? And if it is, they move in. Hopefully it's not your neighbor's house, but if it is, this is what it's going to look like when we open up their ceiling to take out that colony. So very quick, very short time period. We talked about the preventative stage being 4 to 6 weeks long. This active swarm period is going to be much shorter. It's going to be typically 5 to 7 days long. And this active swarming period is going to be from the time you see a viable queen cell until it's capped. And we know that queen cells are capped roughly on day 8. So you have a 5 to 8 day window where this type of behavior is going to happen, and you can identify it. Now, we talk about why colonies swarm. We should also talk about why colonies don't swarm. And it's lack of productivity, a lack of resources. It's not a good nectar flow. The colony may not be healthy in that they exist, they survive winter to winter, but they're just not able to build up fast enough to that swarm mode. They're just healthy enough to exist, and that's not a very productive colony. So if you have a colony like this, it's not one that you want to consider successful. It's one you want to consider requeening so that they do become successful. As we move forward, when we look at this active swarm period, this is what it's going to look like inside the colony. You're going to see these queen cells, right? These swarm cells, these peanut-shaped cells that are on the lower third of the frame. They're being elongated. These ones are not capped off yet, but you see a lot of capped brood larvae around them, and you typically see these in clusters. You might see a half a dozen, you might see 2 dozen, and it all depends on how big the colony is, the genetics, those types of things. Now, when we get into this active swarm mode, there's ways that we could determine that we could determine where we are in that swarm development stage. What evidence do you see? How old are the queen cells? Excuse me. How old are the queen cells? Where are they placing that new wax? Are they drying out comb? Are they placing it on the top bars? What do the brood patterns look like? Are they putting nectar in the supers, or are they putting it in the brood chamber? And these are all observations that we need to look at as beekeepers. So some of the key elements during this active swarm mode is you want to look at the type of queen cells. Are they supersedure? Are they swarm cells? Are they emergency cells? How old are those queen cells? We know that queen cells are typically capped at roughly day 8. You could argue day 7, day 6, day 9. We're going to use day 8 as the standard, so to speak. We also know that the primary swarms are going to issue from a colony the day of or the day before these swarm cells are capped. And of course, that's weather dependent. If it's been a long, rainy week, they might hold them for a few days. If it's prime weather, that cell gets capped and boom, the swarm's going to take off. You might want to look at how many queen cells are present and what stage they're in, because this is going to determine how many times your colony may or may not swarm in addition to the first primary swarm. And we know that secondary swarms, or after swarms as they're called, were issued from a colony with one or more virgins. I've found as many as 12 virgins in a swarm. I've had reports of as many as 25. So you could have multiple virgins in a swarm, and they are going to leave the colony within a day or two after the virgins emerge. And that translates into about 8 to 14 days after your primary swarm. So I often get a lot of phone calls. People will panic because they saw a swarm in their yard. They captured it. The first thing they do is they say, well, it can't be my swarm. It's not mine. And then you convince them that it is, and fine, you tell them what to do. Well, then about 8 to 14 days later, they call back and say, I had another swarm and I know this is not my swarm because my colony already swarmed once. And you have to go through the process and explain to them that the first swarm left when the first queen cell was capped. The second swarm or the third swarm left 8 to 14 days later because the second round of virgins have emerged, and now we're going into that really crazy mode. So keeping these types of this math and biology in mind is going to help you develop where we're at. So in determining where we are, as I talked about just a little bit ago, the type of queen cells are very important. It gives you the information on the health of the colony. The presence of queen cups, what do they mean? Is there an egg in there making it a viable queen cell, or is it empty, making it just a play cup at the moment, but the potential to be a queen cell down the road? So we find a queen cup, we open it up, and lo and behold, there's an egg in there. Now, knowing from bee biology, we know that an egg is an egg for 3 days, and then it hatches into a larvae. Well, we should also know that as an egg matures into that, before it hatches, it starts to lay over. So when it's laid at day 1, it's standing upright. At day 2, it lays about 45 degrees. At day 3, it lays flat, hatches into a larvae, and we're off and running. So in this stage, looking at this picture, and I know it's not a very good one because of the angle, but this egg is laying just about flat. So we know we're about 2.5, 3 days old. It's getting ready to hatch into a larvae, which tells me that I have about 5 days to do something, because 5 days from now, this larvae had been hatched, the cell's going to be capped off, and that's when my first swarm is going to leave. So if I see a bunch of queen cups or queen cells that have eggs in them, I've got about 5 days to do something. Or I might see a queen cell with a larvae, and it's not a great picture, but you see that big fat larvae that's in there. You see the elongated queen cell. It's not capped yet. This queen cell is probably about 6 days old, maybe 7. And I've got about a day or two here before this queen cell is capped. Assuming no other queen cell is capped in the colony, as soon as this one gets capped off, boom, my swarm is going to take off and away we go. Or we get into this and we see a capped queen cell here on the left. And this capped queen cell, we know that it's at least 8 days old, and we know that they emerge at 16. So, using that math, we can tell where we are. So in this case, the colony clearly swarmed because I have a capped queen cell, but I don't have a virgin yet because it hasn't emerged. Versus if you look at this frame on the right, I've got capped queen cells here. I've got an emerged queen cell here. So not only did my first swarm take off, there's a good chance I might have lost a secondary swarm, but maybe not, depending on the status. More importantly is determining the age of the cell. If you look at the difference between the two queen cells, the younger queen cell has a more uniform look to it with the wax from the tip all the way to the base. Versus if you look at this queen cell, the tip of that queen cell is exposed. The wax has been removed and it's exposing the cocoon, which you can see down here as well. This is what we call a ripe queen cell, meaning it's 15 days old. So I have a day before these virgin queens emerge, and I need to do something and hopefully do it beforehand. So indicators of healthy colonies, but certainly the age of the queen cell is what you want to be paying attention to. In this case, we have an emerged queen cell. So not only did my colony swarm once, it probably swarmed twice. And I definitely have virgin queens running around because I see this little hinged door that's just hanging there, indicating that the queen has emerged and she's off doing something at this point, maturing. Or I might come in and I see this queen cell where you can see the exposed tip, but I see this large opening in the side. It's indicative that there was a queen in there, but her sister emerged first. She came over, chewed a little hole, stung her sister to death in the cell. The workers enlarged the opening to remove the carcass, and that's it. So the colony swarmed, secondary swarm, and in the meantime, I've got a queen running around, a virgin queen stinging her sisters to death. So again, just helps you determine age of the queen cell and whether or not you actually had a queen in the colony itself. In addition to age, you want to look at the type of queen cell, because not all queen cells were created equal. The time of year is not as important as the type and the age, because you could see queen cells almost every month of the year, depending on the stage that colony is in. The swarm cells we're most familiar with, typically on the lower 2/3 of the frame, or the lower third of the frame. These elongated peanut-shaped cells. They're what we call a planned event. The bees know they're going to reproduce, so the cells are well fed, they're fat, they're long, they're ready to go. If you run foundationless frame or top bar colonies, you'll often see queen cells along the edge of the brood nest. So they might be up higher, but they're going to be on the outside edge of the nest itself. Compare this to emergency queen cells, where you see a larger number of them. They're short, they're stubby. This is an unplanned event, right? Something happened to that queen and they scrambled. In this case, looking at the frame, what we see here in the middle is a bunch of empty cells. What should be eggs and larvae are just empty cells. And on the outside, as we progress, you have cells that are bees that are emerging, and the outside you see these queen cells. Knowing how a queen lays, that she starts in the middle and works her way outwards, it would make sense that you're going to have older brood in the middle that's emerging, younger brood on the outside edge. This frame here was from a beekeeper that I was mentoring. They called and said they needed to buy a queen from me because they had a colony that swarmed. They didn't have eggs or larvae. Started asking some questions and didn't seem right. So it was only a couple miles away. So I ran up there, went through the colony with them, and found this frame and did some discussion just like we are now. And they took notes, fortunately. We went back in notes and we made some observations. We noted that the queen cells are capped, so they're at least 8 days old. We have brood that's emerging. So that old brood was at least 21 days old. And what turned out to be that 12 days prior to this picture being taken, the beekeeper was in their colony, strong, healthy colony. They put it back together. They killed their queen by accident and didn't realize it. And the colony reacted by producing emergency cells. So a perfectly healthy colony that was in the middle of swarm season, had the potential to swarm, ended up being set back because the queen was killed accidentally and they're trying to reproduce a new one. A similar situation here, where a colony during swarm season actually had a queen that was failing. Again, supersedure is a planned event, so you have large queen cells, again, compared to the short emergency cells. But you have these elongated peanut-shaped shells in the cells in the upper 2/3 of the frame, fewer in number, typically 2, 3, 4 cells at most, versus the swarm cells are going to be, half a dozen or more. It's a planned event because the queen in the middle of swarm season just wasn't producing, so the bees decided to supersede her and go on their merry way. So the type of queen cell is just as important as the age when you're looking at bees during swarm season. Now, I mentioned colony equilibrium earlier in the presentation, and the equilibrium, a colony in equilibrium is one queen, many workers and drones, and it's thrown off by the production of these extra queens, if you will. So in order to get back to colony equilibrium, we have to eliminate some of these queens. And there's 4 mechanisms of elimination that does not include the primary swarm. So we get into swarm mode, they start building all these extra queen cells. The primary swarm, the first swarm takes off and leaves, and now we're out of balance, right? So one of the methods is queen-on-queen elimination. And this is a situation where virgin queens will fight it out, and whoever survives will head up the colony. That queen-on-queen elimination typically happens at their new home. Occasionally, it'll happen in the parent colony. More often than not, it's going to happen when they arrive at their new home. Because remember, I talked about swarms that have multiple queens in them. That's just a nature's way of providing that they're going to have a queen when they get to their new location. Queens fight, one of them wins, goes out and gets mated, and you're moving. The next common one is pre-emergence destruction. This is the aborted queen cells. So this happens at the parent colony, where one queen emerges from her cell first, goes and locates her sister queens by piping. She stings them to death through the queen cell, and that's the pre-emergence destruction. You have secondary swarm departure. So swarms take off with anywhere from 1 to 15 or more virgin queens. That's another way of reducing the number of virgin queens in the parent colony. And then, of course, you have what we call the balling of unwanted virgins. And you've probably seen this and not realized what it was. But if you've ever gone to catch a swarm that's hanging from a limb, and you look down below that swarm, and there might be 1, 2, or 3 little tiny clusters of bees, and you tease the bees apart, and lo and behold, there's a virgin queen in there. Well, that's not the only virgin queen in that swarm. It's one of many. And the bees are actually, during this process of moving to a new home, choosing the queens that they prefer. Even virgin queens put off a certain amount of pheromones, and they will select queens that have stronger pheromone production than the queens that don't. And those queens that don't produce a lot of pheromones are the ones that get balled. They get a number of workers that go around her, and they heat her to death, and they kill her. And oftentimes you'll see them drop from the swarm on these little clusters. All 4 of these mechanisms can take place at the same time, right? You could have queen-on-queen eliminate. Well, queen-on-queen elimination takes place at the new home, but pre-emergence destruction, secondary swarm departure, and balling of unwanted queens all happen during this secondary swarm process. And that's in order to get our equilibrium back into place. Now, as we move through this very short time period, that 5 to 8 day time period of active swarming, we move into what I call swarm management. And this is the stage that now we see queen cells of all stages. We're not sure if the colony swarmed or not. Where are we at? What do I do? Do I buy a queen? Do I give up beekeeping? Where are we? And this is a very frustrating time for beekeepers. So before you do anything, evaluate the condition of the brood. If a colony has swarmed, you're going to see that brood in the late stage of development, late larval stage, cat brood type of thing. You'll see nectar being backfilled into the brood area. You're going to see queen cells that might be sealed, aborted, emerged, all those types of things. And again, you have to understand that equilibrium that we just talked about takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So what does that mean? Well, 2 things that beekeepers are. We're cheap and we don't have patience, right? We're impatient when it comes to this. So when it comes to equilibrium, we have to remember that it takes some time. Typically, right around this ripe queen cell stage or the 7-day-old virgin stage is when I get phone calls from beekeepers that want to purchase queens from me. And they say, my colony swarmed a while ago, and I'm not seeing a queen. I can't find her. There's no eggs, this, that, the other thing. And in reality, we might still need to wait for another 21 days before you see an actively laying queen. And that's because of this equilibrium that has to take place. They have to swarm multiple times. They might, pre-emergence destruction, all this good stuff. So a lot of times, this is a stage where I talk about, let me see what the next slide is. No, this is a stage where I talk about doing what's called a frame test. So I get a phone call from Landy who says, Steve, I can't find my queen. My eyes are too old to see eggs. I don't know what's going on. I need to purchase a queen. I need to buy one right today. So I'll talk her down and say, look, here's what you need to do, because chances are your colony swarmed, but you need to be patient. So what I do is what's called the frame test. And what I will do, and this is where you have multiple colonies, ideally, I have a suspected queenless colony, and what I'll do is I'll go into a queen right colony and I'll find a frame that has a frame of eggs and young larvae in it. I'll take that frame, I'll brush the bees off of it, and I'll place it into my suspected queenless colony. I'll come back in 7 days and I'll check that frame. If that frame has queen cells on it, then I'll know that the colony has recognized that they're queenless and they're going to begin to raise emergency queen cells. At that stage, you have either you could purchase a queen, or you can just wait it out and let them raise their own queen. If you come back in 7 days and you pull that frame out and the brood has developed normally, then there's a good chance you have a queen. She's just not mated yet and you haven't seen her yet. And we'll show kind of what that looks like here in a little bit. So patience is crucial when it comes to equilibrium and honeybee colonies during swarm time. You might be waiting upwards of 3 weeks before you see a queen. So the frame test is a great thing to do to buy you. It buys you some time, and it also gives you answers to whether or not you're queenless. Now, as far as determining when they swarmed, simple observations, simple math, putting it all together, we could figure this out. So the development time of an egg to capping is approximately 8 days. We know that it takes worker brood 21 days to emerge, queen 16 days. We know the mating biology. We know the timing. All this can be narrowed down into a very simple thing where we look at a colony, we look at the frames of brood, and we say, okay, I have open brood present, but no eggs. Chances are she just swarmed within the last few days. Maybe I see capped brood, but no open brood. Well, we know that they swarmed about 5 days ago. Maybe you see no brood whatsoever because it's all emerged, but you see the remnants of a swarm cell. Well, we know that that brood has to emerge at 21 days. The queen, when they swarm the first time, you're not going to have eggs after that. So 3 weeks ago, our colony swarmed, but you don't have a queen that's laying yet. Or worst case scenario, we have multiple eggs and cells. Not only did our colony swarm a long time ago, the queen didn't mate, and now you've got a laying worker situation. So what does that look like? Well, when you go in here, you're going to look at the stage of the brood. In this frame here, we have a lot of capped brood that's emerging. In the center of this frame, we've got a lot of nectar where we should have eggs and larvae. So again, doing that math, when I have emerging brood and I have this amount of nectar in the middle, there's a good chance that they swarmed about 3 weeks ago. Now I'm just waiting for that queen to come back and start laying eggs again. We might take a look at this frame and say, wow, it's a very similar type of situation. I've got all this brood on the outside. I have no eggs or larvae in the middle. I've got a little bit of backfilling of nectar you could see here. You definitely have emerging worker brood, so we know they emerge at 21 days. But lo and behold, look right here on the right-hand side, there's my queen. But I'm not seeing eggs and larvae, so what the heck's going on? Well, she might be mated and hasn't started laying yet, or she might be a virgin and hasn't gone on a mating flight. This is an interesting discussion if we wanted to have one as to whether or not this is a virgin queen or a mated queen. And I'm going to quiz Landy at the end to see what she thinks. But in virgin queens typically have a very triangular abdomen. She's just very pointy in general. Mated queen is going to round off, and her abdomen is going to be elongated and more rounded on all the edges. Excuse me. So this might be a virgin, might be a mated queen that hasn't started laying yet. It's hard to tell, but at least we know that we have a queen in there. So we'll want to come back in about a week to 10 days and check on her again to say what's going on. And we'll see how she performs. This colony here, not so good, right? Really spotty brood, the classic laying worker situation, very sparse population. When did they swarm? Well, we know that all the worker brood is gone, so at least 21 days ago. But not only is our worker brood gone, our laying worker brood is capped, which happens at day 8. So we're well over a month ago that this colony swarmed. They probably swarmed multiple times. And at this point, you don't even have a queen. And what to do with laying workers is a whole nother discussion, which we won't get into at the moment. But in this case, no queen. It's hopelessly queenless. You have to take action to fix it. In this frame, quite the opposite, right? Lots of capped brood, lots of bees, queen cells down here at the bottom, lots of fresh white wax. I mean, this colony is prime, ready to go. The story behind this was a colony that actually had a Michael Palmer queen in it from Vermont. They were on the verge of, I thought I was keeping them on the verge of swarming. I came in, saw all these queen cells. They were actually capped. I panicked because I didn't want to lose her. She was marked. I went through the colony 3 different times. I ended up finding her. I split her off with a bunch of capped brood, put her into a nuke, took care of the queen cells, etc. Came back 2 weeks later. This colony was doing fine. The nuke that I put that queen into packed out the nuke, and she swarmed anyways. So even sometimes your best effort kind of is fruitless at that point. But a strong colony, lots of capped brood, lots of bees. Difficult to find a queen in, but persistence can pay off if you really need to find that queen. Now, this chart is a simple yes or no chart. It takes you through a very simple process of inspecting a colony during swarm season. Are there eggs present? Or if there's a queen present, yes, no. Are there cells? Are they capped? Do they emerge? Do I come back in 14 days? Do I split the colony? This type of thing. If you're leaning in trying to read it because it's fuzzy, there's a reason for that, because for $23 you could buy the clear version in my book. I will gladly sign it and ship it off to you, and you'll get that information at the end of the presentation. Now, what do I do if my colony swarmed? Well, first and foremost, you want to monitor that hive for additional virgin queens or queen cells. You want to monitor for 2 to 3 weeks following to ensure that that colony is queen right. Make sure that they have met that equilibrium again. You might need to split or remove cells to prevent these after swarms. One of the things I often recommend, if you don't want to make splits, if you go in and you know that your colony has already swarmed, I typically remove all but the 2 nicest queen cells, and I leave 2 behind and get rid of the rest. And the only reason I leave 2 is because I want to have a fairly good chance that I'm going to ensure that if one of them is damaged, the other queen's going to survive. And also that even though I've removed all but 2, it doesn't eliminate the chance that they're going to swarm again. It's just going to minimize that opportunity. My hope is that one queen will emerge, kill the other one, and now it's just up to Mother Nature whether or not she gets mated. So what does it look like when you have a colony that you may or may not have a queen? So again, that simple observation, right? So you've seen this frame before. And a lot of people will call this honey bound or nectar bound because there's nowhere for that queen to lay. And you'll often hear the advice of, oh, swap that out and put a frame of undrawn foundation or put a frame of clean comb in there so she needs somewhere to lay. There's really not a such thing as honey bound when it comes to colonies in a swarming situation. The bees know what they're doing. In this case, they're just putting nectar where they know they're going to need it. They're going to utilize it to potentially draw new comb, etc. So in this case, we've seen this frame before. We're not sure we have a queen because of all this nectar. We're not seeing her anywhere. But if we move to, a week later and come into that same colony, look what they've done here. And it's tough to see if you're not paying attention, but you might look and think, oh crap, they're backfilling and I'm being honey bound. But if you look here, look at this nice little area that they've started to clear out. So we went from this, something very similar, to this, and oh look, lo and behold, down here in the lower right-hand corner, there's my queen. So she's not mated yet, and I know that for a fact because I took this picture. I marked her as a virgin, but they were already clearing a spot for that nectar, or from that nectar for her to start laying. And a week later, not even a week later, a couple days later, they moved even more nectar out of there. And if I looked closer, oh, look, there's eggs. So the bees know what's going on. They're going in there, they're checking it out, and they're, even though they were backfilling, as soon as they know that queen is ready to be mated or has been mated, they start moving that nectar out to give her space. So don't worry about it if you see nectar within that brood nest. Now, the pros and cons of swarming, right? We talked about the natural break in the brood cycle. You get a freshly mated, vigorously laying queen, really pumping out the eggs, which is great. You might have an increase in colonies now. You've got some genetic replication of a colony that you really liked. Swarms are great for increasing wax production. Those educational opportunities that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. But of course, now we have the negative aspects, the loss of field force, which results in a potential loss of some honey production. You've got this delayed colony growth as it gets back into equilibrium. Might take 4 to 6 weeks to get back up to good strength. You've got the societal fears, especially in urban areas, right? The little old lady down the street is worried about these millions of bees carrying away her chihuahua. We know that doesn't happen, but it's a fear that society has that as beekeepers we need to address. One of the benefits that we see from swarming is the control that you see with varroa populations. Dr. Seeley did some work back in 2012 that looked at colonies that swarmed versus colonies that did not swarm. And basically what he showed was that colonies that swarmed had a lower mite level than colonies that did not swarm. Now, is it the silver bullet? Is it okay to say, well, yeah, my colony swarmed, I don't need to treat? No, it's not. But it does show that it does have an effect on mites, and it does benefit your colony. So a healthy colony swarms and they benefit from it. Now, what do we do with the swarm? Well, you don't want to return them to the parent colony, right? Because then it can exacerbate that condition that originally caused the swarming. You could use it to make nukes to increase your colonies. You could use them to draw out new foundation. There's 2 queen systems out there. You could sell it or give it away as a package, depending on the regulations of your Department of Agriculture. There's always beekeepers looking for new bees. Lots of things to do with a swarm. You could also let them fly away, but you also run the risk of them moving into your neighbor's house, which is not something you really want to do. As far as circling back around and looking at the outside influences, weather plays a big role in swarming. You know, typically a colony is going to swarm on warm, relatively calm, sunny days. You're going to see swarming mid to late spring. You know, here in Pennsylvania, we're looking early May through mid to late June. And it's probably similar where you are. The time of day, if you take anything away from this talk at all tonight, is the time of day that the colonies are going to swarm from your hives. If you could be in your bee yard at any time during the day, it would be between the hours of 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. during swarm season. That's when most of the colonies are going to swarm. And I can't tell you the number of times I've driven into my bee yard at 12, 12:30, 1 o'clock, and I'm actually watching the swarm come out of the hive and land in that shrub or 60 feet in the pine tree, whatever it may be. So it's a good time of the year. It's also a good time just to drive through your bee yards, and you might already see them hanging on the limb, allowing you to catch them. So it's a neat time of the day to be in there. Compare that to orientation flights, which actually happen later in the afternoon between 3 and 5. And speaking of comparisons, you might be looking at your colony and saying, well, is that a swarm? What are they doing? What the heck? I'm not sure. Well, here's a brief breakdown. The orientation flights, you know, as I mentioned, happen late in the afternoon between 3 and 5 p.m. You're going to see a distinct flight pattern up and down, left and right, directly in front of the colony. Typically happens for a half hour or so, and then that's it. Robbing is going to be frantic flights all over the place. There's going to be bees fighting. There's also going to be more bees trying to get in the colony than bees leaving the colony. So that's typical of robbing behavior. You're going to see that during the dearth, July, early August. And then you have bearding, which also happens in late summer. You'll see this congregation of bees late in the day, early evening, and then overnight into the early next morning, it relieves itself and the bees are gone. It's just hot in that hive. They're hanging out on the porch. But as I mentioned, if you see this type of bee, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you see this type of bearding during prime foraging hours, 10, 11, 12 o'clock in the afternoon, then you're dealing with a swarming type of a bearding. They're waiting for that signal to take off and go. The swarming itself, as far as what it looks like, it's a mass exodus. Typically within about 10 or 15 minutes, the entire swarm has left the hive, and they're in the air for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes until they settle down on a location and then go out. I see there's a question that says, what happens with robbing, more bees trying to get in and get out? The robbing aspect is where bees they're hungry, they're going in to rob out the nectar. So there's a lot of fighting. It typically happens on weak colonies. You'll see bees all along the seams and the entrances and under the lids and on the bottom boards. They're just all over the place, versus swarming is like somebody just opened the gate and the bees are just pouring right out the entrance. So very distinctive behavior differences with that. Now, in summary, when it comes down, you boil all this down into a couple of statements. You want to be proactive and not reactive, right? Think twice before you cut those queen cells off with your hive tool and then put it back in and say, okay, I stopped my swarm. You need to think ahead. You want to start early and be attentive. Pay attention to what's happening in your hive now, so that 4 to 6 weeks from now, you're going to be prepared with nuke boxes, supers, swarm traps, etc. Ask yourself questions and analyze the consequences of the answers to those questions. What happens if I cut down that swarm while I'm looking up at it without a veil on? I'm going to get stung, right? It's going to happen. So you got to think about that before you do it. And also don't limit yourself, right? You need to learn by making mistakes, and we're all going to make mistakes. That's how you learn. Fortunately, the bees tend to correct it for us. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, well, we make note of it and we know not to do that particular thing again. Some of the key points. Time doesn't stand still in the bee yard. You have to manage your bees. It often seems to speed up, right? I'll do it tomorrow. No, tomorrow might be too late. So you need to do it now. Both beekeeping is both an art and a science, right? The science is the knowledge, what you're learning about tonight. I could teach you the science. You could read books. You can listen to all the different beekeepers that are out there, Larry Connor, Dewey Karen, you name it. But the art is the application of that knowledge, right? Applying it to what you do in the field. You cannot be a beekeeper without both of those. Read your beekeeping magazine, scientific journals, beekeeping books, gain that valuable information, join your local clubs. Facebook is not any of these. I'm on Facebook. I get in a lot of these groups. I do it to raise my blood pressure and for entertainment, because it's the greatest and largest source of misinformation in beekeeping. It's very troublesome, the number of people that are Facebook experts that are out there. Quick little story. A few years ago, quite a few years now, shortly after I published the book, somebody had been on Facebook, and when they were asking a question about swarming, and I got in there and answered it. And I can't remember what the actual question was, but I answered the question as well as several other people. And one of them came back and replied to me and said, "Oh, you must be a new beekeeper because you clearly don't understand swarming." And this was right after I published the book. So you could just kind of laugh and bite your tongue and move on. So you're here. Those of you that are here tonight, I appreciate that, because you guys are doing the right thing, getting the right information from the right places. Landy had mentioned she wanted me to talk a little bit about swarm trapping and what I do and how it works. And there's a lot of information out there too. We all know Dr. Seeley is the king of swarms and swarm biology and how they choose to do things. And his ideal setup, his research has indicated that ideally bees are going to want a cavity that's about 40 liters in size, about a 2.5 square inch opening, which is the equivalent of about a 1 3/4 inch diameter circle. They want a cavity that's about 10 to 15 feet high. Higher is certainly okay, but 10 to 15 feet is ideal. It needs to be facing south, well shaded so that it doesn't overheat in the summertime. The shape of the cavity doesn't matter, and the color of the trap, I guess, doesn't matter. So taking that all into consideration, there's a lot of different designs out there. This is my setup, and I run about 35 traps. I have 50 in total. I run about 35 at any given time. And Ultimately, my setup is an 8-frame deep, which is about 35 liters. For comparison, a 10-frame deep is about 43 liters. So you're right in that approximate 40-liter size. I like a 1.5-inch diameter circle. I think a 1 3/4 is almost too big for my situation. I have not had an issue with a 1.5-inch opening. It does really well for the bees. I use a migratory top, a solid bottom board that's plywood. I use Advantech because it's a little bit rated for moisture. My swarm traps are always swarm traps. I don't use them for anything else other than that. So this is why it is the way it is. The first 6 frames are undrawn foundation. The 7th frame is a drawn brood comb, and then the 8th is a undrawn foundation again. I place my colonies 6 to 8 feet high because I don't want to be up on ladders. I don't want to have to carry down a heavy bee-filled hive body down off a ladder. So about 6 to 8 feet high. I use Swarm Commander as lure. Certainly lemongrass is an option as well. It will not perform as good as Swarm Commander. I am not a paid advertiser for Swarm Commander. I know that it works 1,000 times better than lemongrass, and the reason is Nasonov is the gland, the pheromone that we're trying to mimic. Nasonov has 7 chemical components in it. Lemongrass is just one of those components. Swarm Commander mimics all 7, so it's a lot more attractive. I've had bees land on my pocket. Not bees. I've had an actual swarm land on my pocket where my Swarm Commander had been in the past. So it's very potent, very attractive. It works very well. But my traps are facing south. They're very well shaded, as Seeley has indicated. I paint them for concealment purposes with a lighter paint around the opening for contrast. And what that all looks like when we put it together is this. The brackets are custom made. A friend of mine's a machinist. You could use old deer stands. You could hang platforms, whatever you want to do. But it's an 8-frame deep, plywood bottom, 1.5-inch opening. Slot 1 is right here. Slot 7 and 8 is out here. So my drawn comb is farthest away from the opening. I use Swarm Commander inside the box and at the opening and hang it up and let it go. Once I capture a swarm, I actually will close up the opening, take the whole box away, replace it with a new one. Once I take it home, I take the frames out, or I'll actually put the whole trap on top of the box that I'm going to transfer them into, leave them there for 2 or 3 days, and then transfer the frames in. I'll prep the swarm trap for the next use and get it ready to go. So very straightforward. Again, it's a well shaded, so I don't worry about the darkness of the paint. But I did add a splash of light colored paint at the opening just for contrast so the bees can find the opening. So if you don't do a swarm traps or haven't swarm trapped before, I encourage you to try it. It's very entertaining and very fun activity. If you're really bored, this is what you do with swarms. Give yourself a bee beard, take pictures, put it all over social media, get all the likes you can, and have people ask you, are you crazy? And yes, we are crazy. That's why we're beekeepers. So we have fun with it for sure. Shameless advertising. Swarm Essentials is the book published by Wickwasp Press. And again, Dr. Tom Seeley wrote the foreword to my book. So I'm very honored to have that. And with that, I will end the show here and I'd be happy to take any questions. Meadowsweetbees@gmail.com is my email if you want to reach out for anything. Meadowsweetbees.com is my website address. You could order my book directly through the website. It's under Books and Bees, I believe. You could also get it through wickwaspress.com, any of the major bee supply dealers. And I think Landy is probably hoarding 10 or 15 copies, so maybe she'll sell you one of hers. So, and I thank you guys very much for your the opportunity and your attention. And I hear Landy giggling, so I'll send it over to you, Landy.
Yes. Yeah, I unmuted myself. And if you guys come to EAS, we actually are having an EAS this year. So if you go to EAS in Kentucky in August, you can get Steve to sign his book right there and then. I'm sure he will have multiple copies of it, and sell them to you, and he'll no doubt write something completely irreverent on the signature page. I wouldn't even I wouldn't begin to consider having him autograph a copy of that book for me. Because God knows what he would say. It would not be I would never be able to loan the book to anybody else.
Oh, it's not that bad, Landy. Come on.
Oh, let me think. There's questions. You guys have some questions?
I see the one that says suggestion on location of swarm traps. And other than facing south and well shaded, swarm traps, the ideal locations along wood lines, fingers of trees into fields, your neighbor's porch roof works fine. Your own porch roof would work fine. If you're in a suburban rural community, you know, those old wolf trees in the middle of a field that stand alone are often good locations. You know, but in the wood line, you know, along a tree line is good. If you're in an urban area or even in your own bee yard, you know, just stick the swarm trap next to your other hives. I mean, they will find it. If it's baited properly, they will find it. But if you're looking at trapping in unknown locations, wood lines, solitary trees, you know, parks, you know, if you get permission to trap in a community park, you know, the big oak that's in the middle is a great location, those types of things. As far as distance from your own yard, you know, I have space for my bee yards, so I could wiggle room a little bit. As I mentioned, you could bait the very last hive in your yard, you know, right at the end of the row, or you could set them 25, 50, 100 feet away. The bees will find it if they want to be there.
Yeah, I've never, you know, I've actually never had a swarm trap be occupied in one of my apiaries.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
They just, then again, I haven't put Swarm Commander in them either. They're just kind of hanging there in the trees.
Yeah. And well, so that's the other thing too. It's, you know, in those situations, you just haven't given them the time, right? And, you know, we caught them suspended. So what's our, you know, we don't wait to see if they move into the swarm trap. We capture them, put them in a box right away. If you were to wait, there's a good chance they may move it. And I've had the same thing. If I see them hanging on a limb, I don't sit back and go, okay, which trap are you going to go in? I'm going to snag them and put them in a box and done, you know, be done. But that being said, I have one yard where I have a lot of equipment stacked up, a bunch of extra nukes, and I've had them move into the middle of a stack of 40 nukes that's not being used. And you know what is a pain to disassemble 40 nukes from a stack to figure out which one has the swarm in it. It's a pain in the butt. On the Swarm Commander too, I see somebody posted a link to Man Lake Swarm Commander. I don't recommend the gel. I recommend the spray. The spray is a little bit nicer than the gel.
I posted both, Steve.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's Justin.
Yeah, the spray is definitely much nicer. They did come out with a new vial that just came out this year, and I have one in my truck. I crushed it and stuck it in my visor. It's my my air freshener. But it's a little vial it's a plastic vial with a glass insert filled with the lure, and you crush it, and then the tip is just a cotton tip. So you could actually crush it and then smear it where you want and just toss the whole thing in the trap and leave it go for 2 weeks and then rebait it as necessary. So depending on how, you know, what you want to use and what you want to spend. But the lure, the spray, or those vials are just fantastic. I mean, like I said, I don't get paid to say that. They are fantastic. And Landy, I think you remember, I think it was in Jersey or Delaware.
It was EAS in Jersey.
EAS, we had a swarm out of one of the hives out there, and we took the Swarm Commander hanging lure and some spray, and we sprayed it on a trunk of a tree, and the swarm was 60 feet up. I mean, it was way up there. And
they came right down.
I remember they took off and they went over the trees, turned around, and came back and landed right on the Swarm Commander. So it was
very impressive.
And then they stung me. I don't know. Yeah.
That was poetic justice.
It was. Yeah, go figure.
Absolutely. Okay. Jim asked a good question there. He says, I watched bees swarm and came back to the hive a few minutes later. Why did they do that? Why did they?
Good question, Jim.
Yes.
So I often hear people say, "Oh, they were just practicing." They don't
No.
practice. There's no practicing in swarming. You either go or it's a go or no go. In a situation like that, it's usually because the queen could not fly. Either she wasn't slimmed down enough yet. Perhaps a beekeeper clipped her wing. Maybe she was injured in some way. So oftentimes you might see them fly out. They land on a limb for a half hour or an hour, and then they come back. It might even be just a few minutes, and then they'll do it again. And at some point, they'll recognize that they can't leave with that queen. So they'll just hang out until the first virgin emerges, and then boom, they're gone.
And then they go.
Yep. Now, sometimes what you'll find when that happens too is eventually the queen will leave, but if she can't fly, she'll kind of just flop, and you'll find the swarm on the ground, 10, 15 feet from your hive. And that's a dangerous situation too, because if you don't see them, a skunk or raccoon can come along and eat them, or they may treat that queen the same way as if she couldn't leave the colony, and they may try to leave and she doesn't go with them, and they just go back to the hive, and the queen's out there with half a dozen bees and ultimately dies. And then you're dealing with a bunch of virgin queens. So, yeah, that's a common situation. I mean, we see it more often than not. So,
John's got a good question too. He says, do you typically treat your swarms with oxalic acid before they cap their brood? What a great opportunity, right?
It's a great opportunity. I don't do that. My bees don't have mites. I mean, that's easy.
Yeah, right.
But what, you think I have bees from Jersey? Come on. No, that's actually a very good opportunity to be sure, because we don't know where those bees came from. A lot of beekeepers say, "Oh, it's a wild swarm." Well, I tell you, in Pennsylvania, chance of getting a wild swarm is very, very slim compared to all the managed or unmanaged colonies that are out there. But it is a good opportunity. Put them in the box, do a quick, like you would a package, shoot them with some oxalic vapor or dribble, and just to be safe. It's a clean swarm at that point. I usually don't mess with it. I'll tell you this, John. I did I'm in the middle of doing a swarm study with Penn State, and last year I caught 75 swarms, and we dumped them in boxes. We didn't do anything to them treatment-wise, and just started doing mite counts on them. And we didn't get high mite counts until, well, say I caught most of them, say late April through mid-May. We did our first count in the end of May and then the end of June, and we really didn't see an increase in mites until the end of June. So that was just a 1 or 2 mite increase, but by July, it jumped up. So we treated in July and then blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to treat. I don't typically do it, but certainly, everybody has their own management style.
Read Carl's question.
All right.
While you're reading Carl's question, I should point out that back in April of last year, our first virtual meeting, Jim Feeney was our speaker, and he gave a presentation on bait hives and how to make them work.
Yep.
And he went into the details of the dimensions and placing them, and that was, the core of his talk. So if anybody is interested in that, that talk and this one kind of go together hand in hand, and you can go back and watch the previous recording of that at any point.
Yep. Before I get to Carl's question, in regards to swarm traps and dimensions and things like that, often one of the more popular trap styles right now on social media is the 5-frame nuke with the extended bottom on it, and it's popular only because that's what everybody keeps sharing, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong. Where I see that being a problem is that you have the cavity size, but oftentimes if you get a big swarm in there and they draw out those 5 frames, the only place they have the draw then is that loose comb, the free comb down below that. So if you can't get to your swarm traps right away and you go back and pull those frames, you're going to be cutting off comb and rubber banding it back into frames and blah, blah, blah. The nice thing about an 8-frame or 10-frame dedicated swarm trap, if I can't get to them for a week or two and there's a big swarm in there, I come back to 6, 7 frames of drawn comb and it's like you have a full-blown colony out of nowhere. So in my opinion, my design is a little bit easier in that it gives me a little bit more wiggle room. Both work very well. It's just one you have the potential of having a lot of free comb. So just a unsolicited comment there. All right. So Carl says they had already thought there was only one queen, but a swarm learned today that a swarm can have multiple virgin queens, which is correct. If you want to capture a swarm, would all the virgin queens be right in the center? And if you captured the swarm, do you need to make sure you capture the center of the swarm and the rest of the bees will follow? I wish it was that easy, Carl. I really do. No, those queens can be anywhere. And oftentimes, if you sit and watch long enough, even with the original primary swarm, you'll often see the queen kind of just in and out of the cluster. She's constantly moving. So if you stand and watch long enough, there'll be times she'll pop out. And I don't suggest you do that unless you're experienced. But there's been times that I'll grab her and put her in a queen cage, and then I'll shake the bees into a box because then I know where everybody is. When it comes to multiple virgins, your best bet is to get them all in a box in a cohesive manner. So one of my pet peeves is the beekeepers that have a swarm at waist height. They put a box on the ground and then they shake the bees into it, and there's bees flying all over the place, and we don't know who's what, where, and how. And sometimes that's enough of a trigger that you shake them, they land in a box, but it triggers them to want to just take off and go elsewhere. My preferred method is, if the homeowner allows you, is to trim that shrub or that tree branch as neatly as possible and lower that cluster into the box, close it up. You're going to have less bees in the air. You don't have to wait around for them to all gather. You don't have to make a second trip back to come back. You end up with, a couple hundred bees left behind, and that's not a big deal. But to answer the question, yeah, those virgins can be anywhere and everywhere. You don't know how many there are, so you need to keep that swarm contained and placed in a box. You want me to read these, Aunt Landy, or do you want to just go ahead and read them?
I'll read them for you.
Go ahead and read them for me. Yeah, I have trouble with this.
I know you're challenged in the reading department. That's okay.
Oh, man. This is being recorded, just so you know. I have proof.
Any issue with putting a frame with a small amount of resources on it in the trap, like an old brood frame from a dead out with honey and pollen in the corners?
Ooh, good question. Yes, there is an issue. I avoid pollen and honey because pollen and honey is going to attract ants and small hive beetles. And when you attract the pests, that makes the nest a little bit more inhospitable to the bees. So if there's a tiny bit of honey, not a big deal, but the less, the better. You want the odor from that brood frame, that brood comb. The odor is what you're looking for. And also the fact that there's drawn comb, it kind of gives there's no science behind this really, but I think it gives the bees the combination of the odor and the remnants of old brood comb says to the bees, hey, the colony lived here once, so let's make do and let's do it. But the honey and pollen could potentially draw pests, and you don't want that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's actually pheromones in brood. Well, the wax itself produces pheromones, and I think brood comb produces additional pheromone.
Yep. Yeah. John's asking for a friend, quote unquote. Right?
Yes, with 2 dead outs. Yep,
yeah.
We got it.
And if that's the only thing you have, John, then hey, it is what it is, right? It's not gonna be the end all. You just make do, and I would choose a frame with very minimal honey and pollen rather than one that's fully loaded, because they're not attracted to food. They're looking for cavity to draw out comb and the odors that go along with it.
How do you keep bears out of your traps?
I make sure the opening is very tiny so they can't fit. That's a good question too, Jim. I've never had, I'm in bear country too here in Pennsylvania, and that time of year, our bears are gorging on everything except for bees. So my issue is raccoons. The raccoons are just those, they're investigative, curious little, can't beep, can't say the word. And a lot of times what I'll do is just ratchet strap the lid down so they can't do it. If you have bears, put them on your neighbor's roof instead of your roof. Keep them within your electric fence. I know Jersey does have a bear problem, but typically that time of year they're engorging themselves on fruits and berries and grass, and they're not really looking. If you get a bear into your trap, it's usually out of curiosity rather than anything. So I don't worry about it too much because I don't have that big of an issue with it that time of year.
Okay.
We've got somebody's typing, a couple people timing.
Let's see. How would you configure a swarm trap using only medium supers? That's a good question.
Yeah, throw the mediums away and go to deeps. That's easy.
Oh, get out of here.
Oh, man.
can
Only real
actually
beekeepers
answer
use
that.
deeps. Only real beekeepers use deeps.
Hey.
Oh, that's right. You use mediums, huh?
Oh, yeah. You remember that, don't you?
So the yeah, boy, mediums. I tell you.
I use a double nuke.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So you can
5
configure your
frame,
swarm
5
trap.
frames. And I
yeah.
use like window locks or sash locks.
Right.
To actually,
Just
so I
lock them
have
together.
2 nukes, right?
Yep.
One on top of another, and they've got foundation with like a frame of drawn comb in there.
Yep.
And, lock them together.
Yep.
And basically very similar setup to yours up
Yep.
in a tree. And that, it's the right size cavity and it works.
Yep. So yeah, with mediums, you could do 2 mediums, just ratchet strap them together. It also depends on, so like I mentioned, I like to use my swarm traps just as swarm traps. So I use dedicated, that's it. But I also run deeps. So with the mediums, the mediums, it is. I mean, it's one of those things, you can't do a dedicated swarm trap with a deep if you run mediums. I mean, it doesn't work. What I would probably do there is just same thing like you did, get 2 mediums together, ratchet strap them. You could get Hive staples and staple them together temporarily. You could do a 5/5, nuke. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it, but that's kind of where you run into an issue with mediums. I mean, you're actually limited, in a way. And the way I actually teach with folks that want to do mediums, I always tell them to at least have 1 deep as the brood chamber, and then run the rest mediums in whatever configuration, because then it just gives you the flexibility. But everybody's different, it is. But I would to answer the question is I would use 2 mediums, top and top, to give you the cavity size, and just strap them together, and however way you want to do it. Ivan says we should take our show on the road. I think we are, right? EAS every summer.
That's right.
Yeah. Catch us live. It's
That's
a hoot.
right.
Or you can just come to every meeting, Steve. I mean, you're invited.
Landy can't afford me.
He is expensive.
Oh.
Overpriced.
What's the word? Overpriced, underworked? No. How's that go?
Overpriced, underdelivered.
Yeah. Overpriced and underappreciated. Jim says, do I keep my traps up until the fall? Only because I don't have time to get to them. They will go up next week, probably, or next 2 weeks. 30 traps is a lot to put up. So sometime between now and the end of March, my traps will all go up. I won't bait them until the first week of April. And then they stay up until September, because we do get some fall swarms. So I try to keep them up as a just in case type of a scenario. But that, again, it depends on your resources. Can you afford to leave traps up? Do you need to use those? Are those traps, do they turn into your production equipment? Once swarm season over, there's a lot of different possibilities there.
Yeah, what is it like with the bees that swarm in October?
Mm-hmm.
I've had bees like swarm just before Halloween, and I'm like pulling the swarm down, knowing that there's no way on the face of the planet that they're ever going to survive the winter, and saying, what the heck are you girls thinking?
So I actually took that slide out of my presentation because I've been given this talk everywhere, Arizona, California, it doesn't apply to everywhere, but I've seen the same thing. And I think it's partly due to a couple of things. One, do you guys get a fall flow? Do you not?
Sometimes, not
Sometimes.
always.
So I think
Sometimes.
I think part of it is related to the fall flow. So you get another peak of nectar, but that also is compounded with I think some swarming has to do with the daylight. So you have this, if you think about, you hear birds singing in the spring, and those same birds are doing their breeding singing in the fall because of the daylight, right? Sensitivity. It's the same amount of daylight in the spring as it is in the fall during those time periods, the photo period. That's what I was looking for. So I think the photo period has an influence on that. The odd thing, though, with fall swarms, and I don't know if you noticed this, but at least in our area, the fall swarms are virgin queens. They're not mated queens. And oftentimes the mated queens are remaining in the colony and the virgin queens are leaving. So that question then becomes, okay, is it more of a sacrificial type of a swarm where, hey, we're overcrowded. This is our way of releasing the pressure. Is it a genetic issue? So, Africanized bees do this type of behavior, but the bees are docile, so it's not that. There's just a lot of unknowns about fall swarms. It could be absconding. Some of these swarms, I've noticed that fall swarms tend to be very small, so I don't think it's an absconding. But you do get some really big fall swarms that's clearly absconding because the whole colony just up and leaves. But there's a lot that we don't know about fall swarms. I've had some fall swarms do really well, but one thing I have noticed is they either have a virgin queen or they don't have a queen at all. And what do you do with that?
Let's see. Jim is saying, I have no brood in my hives yet as of today. Do I have a problem? I don't think so, Jim.
Is he asking for a friend too? No, I don't think so. I mean, we've had a normal winter. I mean, I don't know what you guys have been like out there, but I mean, it's been cold. It's been a normal winter. I mean, the fact that you don't have brood yet, the question I would have is how many bees are in the colony? How many frames? That could be an issue. What's the resources like? Do they have pollen? Because they won't. A queen won't lay if she doesn't have pollen available. So if that colony didn't bring in pollen in the fall, it's possible that they're not going to start laying until the pollen becomes available. So that's a trigger point as well. And I haven't said it's the first normal winter in a while, and I said that earlier. It's actually a relief because I'm not scrambling. Last year at this time, I was putting extra hive bodies in some of my big colonies because they had 4 or 5 frames of brood. And we're not seeing that, which, knock on wood, is a good thing. So,
Jim, earlier, like before 7, Steve and I were talking because we both looked at our bees today, and both of us were saying that there's very little brood in the colonies. Even big colonies have like a palm size, patch of brood on one frame. Because just, think about it. A week ago, we had wind chills early in the morning that were like in single digits. So, the bees are just being smart. They're not brooding up yet because the temperatures have not stabilized. It's just starting to be spring-like weather just now, like a day or two ago.
And that's, and that's a function too of social media and everything else, that we all want bees early. We want everything early. And then when it does happen or doesn't happen, we think there's something wrong. In reality, this is completely normal activity. We shouldn't be having to scramble for swarms in, March. That's not normal. And I think we're so used to wanting stuff early, and then it doesn't happen. We think there's something wrong, when in reality, it's perfectly normal. We just lose touch of it with, nature and what's happening. And this is where, as beekeepers, you need to be observant. When do your dandelions bloom? I'm seeing here, where did I see? I thought I saw somebody talk about, pollen coming in today. What's it coming from?
Skunk cabbage.
Skunk cabbage, yeah. I mean, if skunk cabbage is out now, and if you don't know what skunk cabbage is, Google it. It's a wetland plant, and it stinks to high heaven, but they have a quote unquote flower in the center of the the flower. There's, the pollen's a nice light white, so like a real pale,
Like a light
yellow.
green. Yeah.
Yeah, greenish yellow, pale. Everybody's colors are different. But it's like that picture of is this a blue dress or a green dress or whatever that, remember that thing that was going around? Everybody thought it was a different color. Anyways, knowing what skunk cabbage pollen looks like, what maple pollen, red maple versus silver maple pollen looks very different versus Norway. Those types of things, you use Mother Nature, because Mother Nature is going to provide you the timeline. No matter what we want the timeline to be, Mother Nature is going to be the indicator. I mean, around here, our spring peepers haven't started yet. I suspect they will in the next day or two with the warm temperatures.
Yeah, mine haven't either. Yeah.
But then it's going back into the 40s again with temperatures in below freezing. So that's just going to keep everything, it's going to temper the growth of a lot of things, and that's okay. We don't have to go from 0 to 100. I talked to somebody today that wanted to reverse their hive bodies and put a super on. And it's like, no, time out. Your bees have just made their first cleansing flight in 3 weeks. We're not going there yet. So, we're very impatient as beekeepers, and that can be detrimental in a lot of ways. So I digress.
Okay, so Megan comments. Okay, this is Megan McConnell, our state apiarist, Steve, and she's saying in Central
but isn't she from Jersey originally?
No, she's in Delaware.
Same thing.
In Central Jersey, we saw some colonies with about 4 frames of brood today. That's a lot.
Those are the ones that they just brought up from Florida. That does not count.
Probably.
It doesn't surprise me, though. I mean, it depends. And I don't, Megan, if you could answer this, is what, were those colonies that were fed, did somebody feed them? Because I did notice, like this year I didn't do it, but if I fed pollen early in the past, starting in January, and I would get colonies that were just booming, but I would have to feed hard candy excessively during the month of March because they were just consuming the carbohydrates to keep the brood going, so that's interesting. But there's always those outliers. I mean,
Yeah. Megan, you're from South Jersey. That's a whole different country. Not related to North Jersey.
Oh boy, so many comments, so little time.
And pollen patty. Okay.
What'd she say? See, there you go.
Yeah, yep, so they were getting pollen.
And that's a perfect example, Landy, that of the beekeepers. And I'm gonna get on my soapbox here because do you know what PPB syndrome is? PPB. Yeah, it's piss poor beekeeping, right? So the you get beekeepers, and I'm not saying it's anybody here, but they don't understand the management aspect of it. Oh, I was told to feed pollen. Well, what's the reason? Well, I don't know. Well, what's the what happens if you feed pollen? Well, they're going to increase brood rearing. Well, when they increase brood rearing, what do they have to do? Consume carbohydrates. So if you don't have enough honey in there, it's blah blah blah. So yes, the fact that she had sugar bricks on with pollen patties. Megan, when did you put them on? If let
no,
us,
it was these hives she was inspecting.
Yeah, these weren't my bees. I started nuke inspections today.
Okay. Do you know when they put them on?
No, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but that's so. But again, that's actually probably somebody, or maybe not. But typically, the beekeepers that want to split early and split frequently get them on sugar and pollen early to get them artificially increased. The average backyard beekeeper doesn't want to do that because you're either going to end up with dead bees at the end of March when we get a cold spell, or they're going to have a swarm April 1st that they weren't prepared for, and there's no drones for those virgins to mate with. Right. So it's it's different. So.
Okay, there was a question earlier. You mentioned absconding. Can I assume absconding is simply a 100% swarm? No. No,
a swarm and an abscond is two different things. They're not totally interchangeable. Different. They're not interchangeable. It's not it's not semantics. Absconding is a complete evacuation of a colony versus a swarm is a reproductive term, right? The colony is reproducing. Now, where we run into issue of semantics is, I mean, it's a swarm of bees technically because they're in the air, and that's the definition of bees in the air. It's a swarm, but in this case, a swarm is a reproductive term and a reproductive period. Absconding is a response to high pest loads, destruction of their colony, something that makes them completely leave 100%, versus a swarm is always a reproductive where there's going to be potentially a mated queen with an abundance of workers left behind. It's a good question, though.
Yep.
Or comment, yeah.
There's a question about skunk cabbage in Jersey City, and yeah, are there like any
What's not in
streams?
Jersey City?
Just because it's urban. Remember, bees fly.
Yeah.
They fly miles. But there are, we've got like little streams and patches of wetlands and stuff all over, even in a lot of the more urban areas.
Yeah. Kurt says there's no bears in Jersey City.
Yeah, right. The Hackensack River you've got going through that area. And there's always a marginal fringe and, skunk cabbage along the fringe of the streams.
It doesn't take much for skunk cabbage to grow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and of course, you're not far away. I mean, with skunk cabbage, right behind is going to be two things. You're going to have the tree, maples are going to start to bloom quick. And then you're also going to have the willows right behind that, or almost simultaneously. Probably this year, it's going to be almost simultaneously given the weather. Not to get into it deep, but you have the growing degree days, right? And each species has a certain amount of growing degree days in order to bloom, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, it's these little things that they could fly. And one other thing we probably should mention, Landy, is the potential for feeding of the bees by beekeepers artificial pollen, right? So I feed Ultra Bee in a dry form in feeders, and the bees are bringing back quote unquote pollen. And if you live down the road from me, guess where your bees are getting fed from? And it may look like pollen to you, but it might be another beekeeper feeding dry pollen. They get into bird feeders and collect bird food dust, the bird seed dust, which looks like pollen. So there's some stuff that they bring back in that may not be pollen. But you also get crocus blooming now, which is a dark orange pollen.
Yeah.
What's the other one? Snowdrops, right? Are they? I don't know. Not really, but
snowdrops don't really have much, but pretty soon you're going to have, pretty much a lot of the spring flowers will produce pollen.
Your blue scilla. I mean, all that stuff is those little flower. Winter aconite is
Witch
blooming.
Hazel just got mentioned. Yes. That's even earlier. Witch hazel is actually
witch hazel. Yeah, the native witch hazel is in November, but there's a lot of variants that bloom December, January, February, March. So it's
silver maple. Yes, will bloom this week in the southern half of the state. So that means
that's like Florida.
It's going to be probably another week or two before we see it up here.
Right. I'm looking at my trees around here. The maples are starting to get that nice red hue. So the buds are starting to swell. So they're going to happen probably within the week. The willows are getting that, that green hue on the new growth. Right. So they're going to pop their buds here in the next 10 to 14 days. Silver maple and red maple are going to bloom very similar, closely to each other. So I think, well, I'm not sure which blooms first because they're always very close. But it's going to happen. But that's okay. The problem then is are we going to have the foraging weather?
Yeah.
My bees will forage at 40 degrees or 45 degrees. Excuse me, but it's going to limit how far they can forage.
So here's a question: what's the best time for no graft queen rearing?
Warm season.
Yeah.
Yep. That's because that's
nectar flows.
Prime nectar flows. Yeah, that's when the bees are gonna, want to do it. So if you're not wanting to graft and you're using one of the other methods, or heck, even if you don't want to use any, swarm cells are fabulous for creating splits and nukes and requeening and all that. Because the one thing you have to remember though is you don't want to wait till those queen cells are capped, because you're going to lose additional swarms when those things are capped. But if you harvest them, whether it's the whole frame or cut them out gently while they're still uncapped, you just have to watch that you don't knock the larvae out of that bed of royal jelly. But when swarm season starts, that's the best time for no graft queen rearing.
It's actually the best time for any queen rearing.
Queen rearing.
Even your grafting too. You know,
Yep.
that's when I like to raise my queens because the
Yep.
conditions are ideal.
Yep. And that's a triple whammy because not only do we have to find time to graft, we have to find time to get into our colonies and stop swarms and
Super.
splits. And,
Yeah. Everything.
yeah. It's a busy time of the year for everybody. Just run,
Yep.
run, run.
Yep. Yep.
Cool. So either everybody knows everything or their heads are spinning.
I think we're just about nearing up on the end here.
I think, yep, I think that
Mandy
I
just came up for another breath. We're good for another 20 minutes.
no. I turned into a pumpkin in 20 minutes.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I guess so. It is past your bedtime.
Not
I
quite.
think if
not quite.
If I just leave the two of you, I think we can fill up the last 20 minutes without a problem.
Oh,
I think we got a fan with Ivan. He's gonna follow us around. We'll see him at EAS.
yeah. Yep. Oh,
Nah, we have a fun time. I mean, it's one of those, that's what beekeepers do.
Yeah,
The only thing we're missing is a beer to sit around and talk with. But
yeah. Yeah, in case you guys haven't figured it out, Steve and I have known each other for a long time.
yeah, too long.
I agree.
Do I know you? Yeah, we have unfortunately we have a lot of inside jokes, but they're good jokes. It's just funny things that keep us rolling. And then we have the same type of personality, so that helps too. But no, I
Hey,
appreciate
stop
it.
insulting me. That's not right.
What, did I know you or friends?
That we have the same type of personality.
Oh yeah, right. Well, same personality, but we all know I'm a better beekeeper. So,
Indeed.
but no, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys. I miss seeing the faces on Zoom, but that's
Yeah.
okay. I'm hoping that I'll be able to see everybody in person at a live conference or whatever it may be. But certainly, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. I'll do my best to answer within a reasonable amount of time. Landy will tell you, it gets crazy. How many times have we talked to each other, Landy, where we're in the bee yard trying to get stuff done, right? It's
Yeah.
It's crazy, but certainly, my website, my book's on there. Feel free to order that, and I'll get that out as well. And if there's anything else I could do for you guys, let me know. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys about swarming and entertain you and answer questions as well. So
Thanks, Steve.
thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Steve.
Sure,
This
you
has
guys
been
have a good night.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, guys.